This is part 3 on the Nesting Bowls of Belonging infographic, and I'm asking, what are the barriers to creating belonging in a school? I use 3 lenses on possible points of resistance to belonging. So first, here are several structural barriers to belonging. What if students don't speak the language of instruction, or the school is not inclusive of diversity in other ways? Children and teens who need more outdoor or physical activities can easily feel confined and agitated, like they don't belong. Or insufficient funding results in poor maintenance of schools, because how welcoming can under-resourced schools be? Since underfunding means fewer sports or arts and no extracurricular activities. Plus, underfunded schools tend to have stressed teachers and administrators. Those are all barriers with using a structural lens, and I know you can think of many more. And now here's a functional lens. It opens the viewfinder just a bit more to see how the beliefs and values of school staff members impact belonging. Schools have always used a behavior approach, and this is a rational cognitive paradigm. So teachers believe in the importance of strategies to manage chronic misbehavior. It sounds logical, it sounds reasonable, but I want to say this thinking is not very streetwise. Since a behavior approach has a bad habit of arriving on the scene too late. Misbehavior happens first, and then we respond often with micro-aggression, like irritation, impatience, anger, fear, blame, and we set new rules and restrictions all of a sudden. Plus, we look in the wrong direction when we expect children to regulate their big emotions. Emotional regulation is difficult for adults because emotions are always first, fast, and forceful. Therefore, a cognitive approach is the wrong direction. Instead, start with emotional first aid. And this is co-regulation of big emotions in a trustworthy relationship. We calm each other down, don't we? And kids gain a small measure of emotion regulation every time they allow an adult or peer to help them calm down. And what about student motivation to learn and participate? Doesn't the best kind of motivation come from within? So should we use praise and incentives to motivate kids? Of course, we want competent kids, but with many kids, we have to let capacity catch up. And I'm talking about capacity to join adults in those developmental relationships to learn and grow. Tons of praise and incentives simply won't improve emotional capacity, right? Why is that? Because self-awareness and self-esteem are necessary in abundance first, and then self-identity can become the positive guiding force to navigate relationships and larger contexts of belonging. And doesn't it just feel wrong to push for compliance, restitution, or assign blame when working with young children or emotionally needy teens? I'm saying that school rules can be too inflexible and consequences can feel harsh because even adults can struggle with their self-identity. So it's not surprising that teens' feelings of self-worth and belonging at school are easily skewed to the negative. But here's my big complaint. I think behavior approaches are confused about the use of praise for behavior management and classroom assignments. Because as Deborah McNamara says in her book, Rest, Play, Grow, for a child's self-esteem to have solid ground, a sense of significance need to be separated from their performance. So in other words, praise and incentives can undermine self-esteem and unintentionally can make kids too vulnerable to the judgment of others and overly dependent on recognition for their self-worth. The use of praise is worth discussing in depth. But so far in my presentation, my conclusion is schools can lack the emotional warmth for good enough relationships between teachers and students. A behavior approach focused too narrowly on teaching and learning can create barriers to belonging. Schools should be just as concerned with child and teen emotional development. But a learning behavior approach simply cannot make sense of development for 2 reasons. First, development takes its own sweet time, so behavior cannot be understood at face value. Behavior has a hidden history, stretched over time in relationships, activities, and environments, all interacting as ecology. And second, development occurs within relationships, and relationships are voluntary. This is the quality of dependence that author Takeo Doi describes about MA. These are parental relationships in Japanese culture. And he compares MA to attachment in Western culture. He explains that although MA is a driven instinctive emotion, MA, just like relationships in general, can only exist when permitted. Relationships are crucial, aren't they? But they cannot be required, only permitted. So here's one more lens. This is the developmental lens. And I believe we need to add a dedicated developmental lens to this mix, an emotion-focused lens informing relationships, development, and emotions, like all at the same time, because these are the three dynamic working parts of emotional development. Schools need a relational developmental paradigm to remove the sharp edges of the old rational cognitive paradigm. Schools need an emotion-focused approach, which highly values contexts for belonging. So behavior problems can be viewed additionally as relationship problems or a poor school environment fit problem, calling for changes to physical settings or activities. This lens helps us see how emotional functioning is disrupted by emotional needs. So teachers then realize they should respond by coaching kids through activities and using momentary micro-compassions to sustain good relationships. Coaching and micro-compassion statements and actions by the teacher work so well because this is capacity building, capacity stretching. The emotion-focused approach neither assumes nor expects competence. And why is that? Because competence is the end game. Competence is about comparison and assessment, but kids cannot tolerate very much of those until they are much farther along on their journey of self-awareness and self-esteem. Our kids need an abundance of unconditional positive regard for self-identity formation to sustain belonging. I call this a dedicated developmental approach because it's dedicated to including only those practices and patterns which support emotional development. This approach uses situated practices because every school is uniquely resourced through funds and policies or geography and demographics and teacher talents. This approach sets collaborative patterns in classrooms so teachers can engage in what can be called allo-parenting. They're bringing the whole class together as a working unit. And this approach can reset whole school cultures because relationships are the core resource, not programs, not lesson plans, and not kits of materials. Relationships with the best possible scenario, making rewards, praise, and incentives pretty much irrelevant. I'm saying that development should expand the objective of schools to go beyond teaching and learning to build practitioner-designed practices for emotional development. I mean, imagine if the only objective of learning to play chess is to win, because many chess games end in a draw. And it takes time to become reasonably competent in chess. But chess games are worth playing anyway, because the learning is intellectually challenging, self-motivating, and personally rewarding. And this is exactly why capacity should be more highly valued than competence. So one more thing, but this actually is not on the infographic: readiness. Development is about readiness. And we often talk about readiness for reading or math, but what exactly does lack of readiness for relationships look like? In a nutshell, lack of readiness is always going to be reluctance. Reluctance to participate, to show emotions, and to trust, or reluctance to speak up, or try something new, or share, reluctance to take turns. Reluctance is an emotional barrier to belonging. So just to summarize, microaggression is common in an ecology of arrested development. Microaggression promotes reluctance. And in great contrast, micro-compassion is common in an ecology of active development. Micro-compassion promotes readiness. So I wonder, are schools living a partial life of potential? Because why aren't schools proficient in whole practices which set patterns of micro-compassions, ensuring every student has multiple developmental relationships? That's the end of all of my presentations on belonging. But please send me your questions or comments on this post, and check out Wolf Wisdom on YouTube for all 4 deep dives that I've posted so far. Next month, I'm going to talk about the filter bubbles of trauma infographic. And as always, I believe our presence is powerful in the life of a child. We cannot grow up for our kids, but they cannot grow up without us. Emotional development, I love this topic.